Welcome to the Global News Podcast on YouTube. Hello, I'm Oliver Conway. And today we're joined by the BBC's New York business correspondent, Michelle Fleury. Michelle, the US-Israeli war with Iran continues to disrupt oil and gas markets. How bad is the energy shock for the global economy?
Look, I think there is growing concern that it's going to do lasting damage, but it's not sort of in one immediate big shock. It's going to kind of ripple out over time. Obviously, everyone is aware most immediately of kind of the prices that they've seen increasing at the petrol pump. But, then you get the secondary effects. So diesel is one of them. It's crucial for shipping. That means that items will go up in price further down the road. We've talked also about not just oil and gas, but also other commodities that are affected, like fertilizer. So again, as the prices of those rise because of shortages, then that has a knock-on effect both on the volume of crops, but also on the prices of crops. And that will feed through ultimately into kind of what people pay at the grocery store. There are things like helium that could have a huge impact on another big story we've talked about all year, which is AI and the growth in artificial intelligence. Helium is a gas that is crucial in the production of chips that are used in the development of AI. So again, about 30% of the world's supply is locked up in the Strait of Hormuz. That is also beginning to cause challenges. And we haven't even touched on jet fuel. They're warning in Europe that they could run into shortages by May, and that could have a huge impact on sort of airport hubs around the world, major hubs. So that's also something to watch out for. I think it was the boss of Ryanair, one of Europe's largest aircraft carriers, who was warning that they might run out in May. So that's another huge concern that sort of we're going to have to grapple with.
And on top of those immediate direct effects, are there wider intangible elements to do with confidence for perhaps people investing and things like that?
Markets have been focused more in some ways on words than on actual action right now. And what I mean by that is, if you look, whilst we're talking, the stock market here in America has opened higher. And that's because traders are kind of counting that this will all be over soon, in a couple of weeks maybe. If that optimism proves to be unfounded, then you could see traders reassess. So the messaging has played a key role in terms of how markets have reacted, somewhat disconnected in some ways to the actual economic impact.
Now, we're seeing high oil prices, but also fears of shortages. And so governments are now taking action to try to limit use. Take us through what we're seeing around the world, and particularly in Asia, which seems to be the worst affected area.
Yeah, the thing to remember here, right, is that the Strait of Hormuz is this critical sort of waterway through which oil and gas travels. And where is most of that oil and gas headed? Well, it's headed to Asia. So it follows, therefore, that a lot of the impacts of this are being felt and hardest in Asia. If you look just a couple of days ago, we had the Philippines, the government there declaring a state of national emergency. In other parts of the region, Pakistan and others, they're also struggling with shortages of oil and gas and trying to figure out how to kind of change habits to reduce it. So typically when you have a crisis, the first instinct is there a workaround? Is there another way to get the oil or the gas that we need? Then the second thing is you start seeing, once that kind of process has been worked through, then you start to see people trying to reduce demand. And I think that's what's happening right now. So there are talks about 4-day work weeks in some countries, because again, that will reduce the amount of oil and gas that's being consumed. In Australia, I mean, it was stunning. You heard the Australian leader coming out, addressing the public and suggesting, could they please not sort of get in their car and drive anywhere if they don't have to, so that they can conserve fuel for those who need it most, for industry and business and farmers. And I think the longer this goes on, people will be worried about, are people trying to sort of hoard as much as they can? But that is always a worry in these types of situations. These are sort of things that could have impacts long after this crisis is over. And it shows the way what's happening is the attempt to try and reduce demand to kind of address the fact that there is a supply shortage.
You mentioned markets were going up at the moment on hopes that this would finish soon. If it was all over today, how long would it take for things to get back to normal in the energy markets?
The answer is not quickly, not overnight. And the reason is that some of the damage has been done is much worse than just reopening a shipping waterway. I mean, if you think back to Iran, part of the retaliation they did was an attack on a gas facility in Qatar. I mean, rebuilding that and repairing that infrastructure could take a couple of years. So that is, supply that is now offline for an extended period of time, or at least reduced. That's why people are saying, look, the economic damage of this is going to far outlast the length of this conflict. And potentially, obviously, the longer it goes on, that damage could get worse and worse. I mean, we don't know yet, what will happen. Overnight, there was sort of damage to a steel plant in Iran. So again, these kind of longer lasting attacks on infrastructure, those are things you don't bounce back from overnight.
What about longer term effects? Might this ultimately lead to changes in energy policy across the world?
There is obviously going to be a huge reassessment. People looking at supply chains, wondering where are the vulnerabilities? What can we do to change that? And it's hard to kind of calculate how things will shake out. But interestingly also, what does this do longer term for the Gulf countries? They have been such a centre of economic activity in the last few years. Will that just bounce back as if nothing had ever happened? Or is there now permanently some sort of dent in confidence when it comes to those economies? The other thing also is, we've seen huge tech investments in AI in Gulf countries. Will that continue? Will there be worries going forward? I mean, there are still a lot of questions to be answered.
And what about a push for renewables so you don't have to worry about where you get your oil and gas?
All of that is on the table. I remember, one of the first weeks of the conflict reading something about, will this be good for renewable energy because there is now a focus. That being said, I was reading something about a plant in Michigan that had been set up to deal with electronic vehicles. And, America has turned away from electronic vehicles. They don't think that oil at higher prices for a few months will do much to bring it back. So, in some parts of the world, there will be longer term conversations. I could see in the UK, there are conversations about what to do in the North Sea. Potentially it has the opportunity to boost renewables, but these are long-term investments and that may require oil higher for longer.
Michelle, thank you very much. Michelle Fleury, the BBC's New York business correspondent. If you'd like to hear more from the Global News podcast, click the link below. Thanks for watching.